Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts. It boosts the story to thousands more. A wall of Apache riders stood at his gate. 300 warriors, maybe more, stretching across the horizon like a living fence of dust and shadow. Dalton Crest watched them through the cracked window of his cabin, his hand trembling against the wooden frame. He knew why they were here. 3 days ago, he'd given away the only thing keeping him alive. His last water to two Apache women who'd appeared at his fence, desperate and dying under the merciless sun. What he didn't know was that those women were the chief's daughters, and what was about to happen would prove that some debts can't be paid with blood. The sun hadn't been kind to anything in months. The land stretched out in every direction, cracked and pale like old bone. Dalton stood in the doorway of his cabin, squinting at the empty bucket. Near the well, bone dry, had been for 3 weeks now. He'd watched the water level drop day by day, rationing it like a man counting his last breaths. 2 cups a day, then 1, then half. Now nothing remained but the metallic smell of rust at the bottom of the pail. His horse stood in the corral, ribs showing through dull hide, head hanging low. The animal had given up expecting anything better. Dalton understood the feeling. He'd stopped expecting rain 2 months back, stopped hoping for relief 6 weeks ago. Now he just existed in the space, between decisions, trying to figure out which way to die. The nearest town sat 3 days' ride to the east. 3 days without water in this heat meant arriving as a corpse strapped to a saddle. If the horse even made it that far, staying meant the same result, just slower. He'd done the math in his head, H 100 times, always reaching the same bitter conclusion. He walked to the fence line, boots crunching on earth that felt like ash. The desert had swallowed everything soft, leaving only what could survive on nothing. Most white trees stood twisted and gray. Sagebrush clung to stones. Even the lizards had disappeared, probably dead in whatever holes they crawled into. Dalton pulled his hat lower against the glare. The sky burned, white, drained of blue, like the color had evaporated along with everything else. He'd seen droughts before, survived 2 of them, but this one felt different. This one felt personal, like the land itself had decided it was done with people. His canteen hung empty on his belt. He'd unscrewed the cap that morning, tipped it back out of habit, tasted only warm metal and disappointment. The last drops had gone down his throat yesterday at sunset. Since then, his mouth had turned to leather, his tongue thick and useless. He thought about his father, buried 10 miles north under rocks because the ground had been too hard to dig proper. The old man had always said, "The desert taught you what mattered. Strip away everything soft, everything extra, and what's left is who you really are." Dalton figured he was about to find out if there was anything left of him worth keeping. The cabin behind him held nothing of value. A cot, a table, 3 books he'd read so many times the pages fell out. A rifle with 6 shells. He looked at the weapon leaning against the doorframe and felt nothing. You can't shoot your way out of thirst. Tomorrow at dawn, he'd saddle the horse and pointed east. Roll the dice. Maybe they'd make it. Maybe they wouldn't. But doing nothing meant dying slow. And Dalton had never been good at sitting still. He turned back toward the cabin, ready to spend one more night preparing for a journey that probably ended badly. That's when he saw them. 2 figures in the distance, moving slow across the scorched earth. At first, he thought it was heat shimmer playing tricks, but they kept coming, solid and real, walking instead of riding. Apache, his hand dropped to his hip where the revolver sat. 2 women, he realized as they got closer. Young, moving like people who'd been walking too long in too much heat. They stopped at his fence line 30 feet away and just stood there, waiting. Dalton's throat tightened, not from thirst this time, from what he knew was about to happen next. They didn't speak, just stood there at the fence, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Dalton kept his hand near his revolver, though he knew it wouldn't matter much if this went wrong. 2 against 1 when you're half dead from thirst wasn't odds worth calculating. The taller one had her hair pulled back tight. beaded necklaces, catching what little light the brutal sun allowed. Her face was lean, angular, marked by days and the heat. The younger one stood slightly behind, but her eyes held the same fierce determination. Neither showed weakness, even though Dalton could see the signs clear enough. The way they stood, too still, conserving energy. The dried salt lines on there. Sinking. The slight sway when wind pushed against them. They were dying. Same as him. Water. The taller one finally said. Not a question. Not quite a demand. Somewhere in between. Dalton's jaw tightened. His hand stayed where it was, inches from the grip of his weapon. 3 years back, Apache raiders had burned the Henderson place 12 miles south. Killed the man. Took his horses. Left his wife to walk back to town in her night dress. Dalton had helped bury what the buzzards left of Henderson's cattle. The memory sat in his gut like a stone. But these weren't raiders. These were 2 people about to die if somebody didn't help. Ain't got any to spare, he said. His voice came out rough, cracked from disuse and dehydration. The taller woman tilted her head slightly, studying him, the way you'd study a snake you found in your path, trying to determine if it would strike. You have water, she said, not asking, stating. Dalton's eyes flicked to the cabin behind him. The bucket sat just inside the door. 1 bucket, maybe 3 gallons. All that stood between him and becoming another pile of bones the desert would scatter. That water spoken for, he said. By who? The younger one spoke now, her voice harder than her sister's. The dust, the dead earth. Something in her tone made Dalton bristle, like she was calling him a liar, or worse, a coward. He took a step forward, felt the heat radiating up from the ground through his boot soles. By me, by my horse, by the fact that I need to stay alive, same as anybody else. The taller one raised her hand slightly, a gesture that made her sister go quiet. She turned her full attention to Dalton, and he felt the weight of it. We are Aida and Kima, daughters of Cochetta. She said it like it should mean something, like those names carried weight he was supposed to recognize. Dalton didn't know any Apache names. Didn't want to. Knowing names made people harder to see, as threats made them human. He'd spent 3 years keeping them at a distance in his mind, keeping the line clear between his world and theirs. Don't matter who you are, he said. I got nothing to give. Aida stepped closer to the fence. Not aggressive, just closer. Dalton could see the cracks in her lips now, the hollow look around her eyes. You have a choice, she said quietly. We all do. The words hit different than he expected. Not pleading, not threatening, just true. He didn't have a choice. Same choice he'd been avoiding since the water ran out. Keep holding on to what little he had, or let it go and see what happened next. His hand moved away from his revolver, dropped to his side. Kimmy. Mela watched the movement, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Aida's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect for the small gesture of trust. Dalton looked at them both, then looked back at his cabin at the bucket he'd been guarding like a miser guards gold. 3 gallons. Not enough to save 3 people. Not even enough to save 2, but enough to make a choice that would define what kind of man he was when everything else got stripped away. His father's words echoed in his head. The desert shows you who you are. Dalton walked toward the cabin, hearing his boots crunch on the parched ground. Behind him, neither woman moved. They just waited, patient as stones. When he reached the doorway, he stopped, hand on the frame, staring at that bucket like it held the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. What matters when nothing else does? He picked up the bucket, felt its weight, carried it back toward the fence, where 2 strangers stood between him and whatever came next. Dalton set the bucket on the ground between them on his side of the fence. The water caught the harsh light, looking more precious than anything he'd ever owned. 3 gallons of survival. 3 gallons of borrowed time. He stepped back, waiting to see what they'd do. Aida moved first, slow and deliberate. She unlatched the fence gate, the wood creaking on leather hinges. Dalton tensed, but didn't reach for his weapon. She picked up the bucket with both hands, careful not to spill a drop, and carried it back to where Kimla stood. For a long moment, they just looked at it like they were trying to understand why he'd done it. Dalton wanted the same thing. The smart move would have been to turn them away. The safe move, the one that kept him breathing another few days. But standing there watching them, he knew he couldn't have lived with that choice. Not the kind of living that mattered anyway. Kima cooped her hands. Aida poured slowly, let the water pool in her sister's palms. Kimla brought it to her mouth, drank like it was sacred, like every drop carried weight beyond its measure. She drank 3 handfuls, then stopped. Step back. Aida did the same. 3 handfuls each. No more discipline, even in desperation. Dalton's throat ached watching them. His body screamed for that water, but he stood still, hands at his sides, letting them take what he'd offered. When they finished, Ida carried the bucket back toward him, set it down carefully on his side of the fence. More than half remained. He stared at it, confused. They could have taken it all. Could have. Drained every drop and run. Could have done a lot of things, but they'd taken only what they needed to survive the next stretch of desert. You keep what's yours, Aida said. We take only what we need. Dalton picked up the bucket, felt its weight, still heavy enough to matter, still enough to keep him alive a few more days, maybe long enough to reach town. Maybe not, but more than he'd expected to have left. Kima studied his face with open curiosity. Why did you give it? He didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he had too many. Because watching people die when you could stop it seemed worse than dying yourself. Because his father had taught him that what you do when nobody's watching tells you who you are. Because holding on to the last scrap of your life while others suffered felt like dying already. Seemed like the right thing. He finally said, which was both true and completely inadequate. Aida, not at once. A sharp, decisive movement that somehow carried more meaning than words. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she turned to her sister, spoke in their language, quick and low. Kimmy answered, glancing back at Dalton, then nodded. They began walking, not back the way they'd come, but north toward wherever. They were headed before thirst had driven them to his fence. After a dozen steps, Ida paused, looked back over her shoulder. My father will know what you did, she said. Not a threat, not a promise, just a fact. Delivered flat and certain. Then they were gone, disappearing into the shimmer of heat that made the horizon waver like water. Dalton stood holding the bucket, watching until they became nothing but dark spots against pale earth, then nothing at all. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, thicker. He looked down at the water remaining in the bucket. Maybe 2 gallons, maybe less. He did the math in his head, calculating days against distance, thirst against endurance. The numbers didn't add up any better than they had an hour ago. He carried the bucket back inside, set it in the corner, where it had lived for 3 weeks. His cabin felt smaller now, emptier, like giving away that water had taken something else with it. Some illusion he'd been carrying about what mattered, about what kept a man alive. The sun was dropping toward the western hills, painting everything in shades of copper and rust. Dalton sat on the edge of his cot, staring at his hands. They were shaking, not from fear, from something else he couldn't name. The weight of having made a choice that might cost him everything, but somehow felt more right than any decision he'd made in years. Outside, the desert stretched in all directions, indifferent and eternal. Tomorrow he'd saddle his horse and point east toward town. Roll the dice on whether what remained in that bucket could carry him far enough. But tonight he'd sleep, knowing he'd chosen something other than fear. What he didn't know was that 2 days from now he'd wake to a sound that would stop his heart. The thunder of hoof beatots, hundreds of them. And when he looked out his window, he'd see something that proved some debts get paid in ways you never expect. The first day after they left, Dalton rationed what remained. Half a cup at sunrise, half a cup at noon, nothing at night. His body screamed for more, but discipline was all he had left. He measured each portion with the care of a man counting his last coins, knowing every drop pushed death back by hours instead of days. The horse had stopped looking at him with any expectation. The animal stood in the corral with its head low, sides heaving with each breath. Dalton knew he should put it down, save it the misery of dying slow. But he couldn't bring himself to waste a bullet on mercy when survival was already such a long shot. The second day, his hand shook so badly he spilled half a cup trying to drink it. He watched the water soak into the floorboards, disappearing into wood that had forgotten what moisture felt like. For a moment, he considered licking the boards. The thought made him laugh, a dry sound that hurt his throat. This was how it ended. Not with dignity, not with some final moment of clarity. Just a man on his knees trying to suck water from old wood. He didn't bother with the noon ration. Couldn't see the point. The math had stopped making sense. Even if he left now, rode hard, pushed through the night, he wouldn't make it. The water was gone. The horse was dying. The only question left was whether he'd go out here in his cabin or collapse somewhere on the trail. At least here, he had walls, something to lean against when his legs finally quit. By evening of the second day, Dalton had made peace with it. He sat on the edge of his cot, watching shadows stretch across the floor as the sun dropped. The desert had won. Simple as that. He'd played the game, made his choices, and the house always won in the end. No point being angry about it. Might as well be angry at winter for being cold. He thought about Aida and Kimla. Wondered if they'd made it to wherever they were going. Wondered if that water had bought them enough time. At least something good had come from it. At least he'd die knowing he'd chosen right, even if right didn't save him. That night, he didn't sleep much. Thirst had moved past pain into something else. A kind of numbness that made everything feel distant and unreal. He lay on his sea, staring at the ceiling, counting the boards, counting his breaths, counting down to nothing. Dawn came slow and red. Dalton dragged himself to the window, looked out at another day of brutal sun and merciless sky. His vision swam. His head felt packed with cotton. This was the day he figured, the one where his body finally said enough. Then he heard it. At first, he thought it was his heart, the dull thunder of blood in his ears, pressure building behind his eyes. But the sound grew louder, rhythmic, multiple beats becoming one massive pulse that vibrated through the ground and up through the walls. Hoof beats. Dalton pushed away from the window, legs barely holding him. He staggered to the door, pulled it open, stepped in a light that felt like knives. He raised his hand to shield his eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The horizon was moving, not shimmering with heat, actually moving. A line of darkness spreading across the pale earth, getting wider, getting closer, dust rising in a cloud that blotted out the sky behind it. The thunder grew louder, shaking the ground, shaking his bones. Then they came into focus. Riders. Dozens of them. No, more than dozens. Hundreds. A wall of horses and men stretching from one edge of his vision to the other, moving in formation, coming straight toward his property with the inevitability of a storm. Apache warriors. Dalton's legs gave out. He caught himself on the doorframe, held himself upright through pure stubbornness. His hand moved to his revolver, then stopped. 6 bullets against 300 men. The math was even worse than the water had been. They kept coming. The ground trembled. The dust rose higher, turning the morning sun into a red disk barely visible through the haze. Dalton could see them clearly. Now, warriors on horseback, weapons ready, faces painted, moving with the precision of men who'd done this before. At the front, 3 riders separated from the mass. 2 women. 1 man, between them sitting taller than the rest. Something in his bearing that marked him as the one who led. Cochetta. Had to be. Dalton's throat closed. This was it. The price for his choice. They'd come to collect what he'd taken. What he dared to give. The debt for touching what belonged to a chief. The wall of riders stopped 50 yards out. 300 warriors holding position, waiting, silent. The only sound was horses breathing, leather creaking, and Dalton's heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. Cochetta raised his hand. The silence deepened. Cochetta. dismounted first. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, like a man who'd already decided how this would end. He wore traditional dress, marked by patterns Dalton didn't understand. Symbols that probably meant something to those who knew how to read them. A feathered headdress sat on his head, each feather earned through actions. Dalton could only imagine. Aida and Kimla dismounted beside him. They looked different now, stronger. The hollow desperation had left their eyes, replaced by something harder, more certain. They flanked their father as he walked forward, stopping 10 feet from where Dalton stood, swaying in his doorway. The chief studied him for a long moment. Taking measure, Dalton tried to stand straighter, tried to look like something other than a dying man, barely held together by stubbornness. Failed completely. You gave water to my daughters, Cochetta said. His voice carried across the space between them, deep and measured. Not angry, just stating fact. Dalton's throat was too dry for words. He nodded. Your last. Water, Cochetta continued. The only thing keeping you alive. Still no anger. If anything, his tone held something that might have been curiosity. Why? The question hung in the air between them. Dalton swallowed, tasted dust and copper. When he finally spoke, his voice came out as barely more than a rasp. Seemed wrong not to. Coachetta's expression didn't change. Wrong to who? To me. The chief tilted his head slightly. Considering this, behind him, 300 warriors sat motionless on their horses, waiting for whatever signal would come next. The dust they'd raised began to settle, coating everything in fine red powder. You knew who we were, Cochetta said. You knew what our people have done to yours, what your people have done to ours. Not a question, a statement of the truth they all lived with. You had reason to let them die, to keep what was yours. Dalton's legs were shaking. He locked his knees, refusing to fall in front of this man and his army. Had reasons to help them, too. What reasons? There were people dying. I had something they needed. Dalton paused, gathering strength for the rest. The fact that we'd been enemies didn't change what was right in that moment. Kimla spoke for the first time, her voice sharp. Most men would have let us die, would have watched us beg, would have felt justice was served. Most men ain't me, Dalton said. Then, because he had nothing left to lose, added. And if that's why you're here, to settle what you think needs settling, then do it. I'm too tired to run and too dried out to fight. Silence. The kind that pressed on your ears and made you aware of your own heartbeat. Dalton waited for the signal for the rush of warriors for whatever end they decided he'd earned. Instead, Cochetta did something unexpected. He turned to Aida, spoke in their language. She answered, glancing at Dalton, then back at her father. A conversation happening in words Dalton couldn't understand, deciding a fate he had no voice in. When Cochetta turned back, his expression had shifted. Not softer exactly, but different, like he'd made a decision that surprised even him. My daughters told me what you did, how you gave. Without being asked, how you took nothing in return, how you let them choose how much to take. He paused. Let the weight of those words settle. They told me you had the eyes of a man who expected to die soon, who gave away his life so others could have theirs. Dalton said nothing. What was there to say? It was true. Cochetta took another step forward, close enough now that Dalton could see the lines around his eyes, the scars on his hands, the weight of leadership that sat on his shoulders like something physical. We did not come for revenge, he said quietly. We came because debts must be paid. Before Dalton could process that, Cochetta raised his hand again. This time the warriors behind him moved, not forward and attacked sideways, parting like a gate opening. Through the gap they created, Dalton saw something that made no sense. More horses, pack animals loaded with bundles, water containers, supplies, enough to keep a man alive for months. You gave when you had nothing, Cochetta said. Now we give when we have much. This is not mercy. This is not charity. This is honor recognizing honor. This is what happens when a man proves that humanity matters more than history. Dalton stared at the supplies, then at Cochetta, then at Aida and Kima. His mind couldn't make the pieces fit. They brought help. An army had come to his fence, not to take his life, but to save it. I don't understand, he finally managed. Aida stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. You will, she said. Before we leave, you will understand exactly what you did and what it means. Warriors dismounted and coordinated. Silence. They moved with purpose, unloading supplies, carrying water containers toward Dalton's cabin like. They planned this down to the smallest detail. Dalton watched, still trying to make sense of it, his body swaying with exhaustion and dehydration. Coach Ida gestured to the supplies being arranged near the door. Water, food, medicine for your horse, enough to sustain you until the rains return or until you decide to go elsewhere. Why? The word came out, barely audible. Dalton cleared his throat, tried again. Why would you do this? Kimla answered before her father. Could, because you saw us as people first, not as Apache, not as enemies, not as threats. She moved closer, her expression intense. Do you understand? How rare that is. How many would have turned us away? How many would have smiled while letting us die? Most men hold on to everything when they have nothing left. Aida added, you let go. That takes a kind of strength we recognize. Cachetta raised his hand, silencing his daughters. His eyes never left Dalton's face. Among our people, water is sacred, not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. Life, survival, the choice to continue. He paused, letting his words carry weight. When you gave her daughters water, you gave them more than moisture. For their throats, you gave them proof that honor exists beyond tribal lines. Dalton leaned against the doorframe, trying to stay upright. I just did what seemed right. Exactly. Coach had said, you did not think about reward, did not calculate advantage, did not consider what you might gain. You simply acted from something deeper than strategy. He took another step closer. That is what we came to honor, not the water itself, but the man who gave it away when keeping it meant his own survival. One of the warriors approached carrying something wrapped in leather. He handed it to Cochetta with reverence, then stepped back. The chief unwrapped it, slowly, revealing a necklace made of bone and stone strung on leather cord. The craftsmanship was intricate, each piece selected and placed with obvious care. This belonged to my father, Cochetta said, holding it up so Dalton could see. He wore it through every battle he fought, every treaty he negotiated, every decision that shaped our people. When he died, he told me to give it only to someone who understood that true strength is not about taking. It is about knowing when to give. He stepped forward, closed the distance between them. Dalton stood frozen, barely breathing. As Cochetta reached up and placed the necklace around his neck, the weight of it settled against his chest, warm from the chief's hands, heavy with meaning he was only beginning to grasp. You are now brother to our people, Cochetta said. His voice carried across the silent gathering, making it official. When you need help, we will come. When we need help, we know you'll answer. This is not debt. This is not obligation. This is recognition that honor has no borders. Dalton's hand moved to the necklace, feeling the smooth bone and rough stone. His throat tightened, but not from thirst this time, from something else entirely. Emotion he didn't have words for. I don't deserve this, he managed. That is why you do, Aida said softly. Men who deserve honor rarely recognize it in themselves. The warriors who'd been unloading supplies stepped back there. We're complete. Water barrels lined the wall of his cabin. Food supplies sat in neat bundles. Everything he needed to survive, given freely by people he'd spent years fearing. Cochetta placed his hand on Dalton's shoulder. The gesture was brief, but carried weight that went beyond physical touch. You prove something important, that the choice to help someone costs nothing but fear. And fear is the poorest reason to let someone die. He turned to his warriors, spoke in their language. They mounted their horses in the same coordinated silence they'd shown arriving. 300 men moving as one, preparing to leave as suddenly as they'd. Kulme. Kimla paused before mounting her horse. The water you gave us reached our camp. Because of it, 3 children survived who would have died. Your choice saved more than just us. The words hit Dalton harder than anything else had. He'd given water to 2 people. That gift had rippled outward, touching lives he'd never see, changing outcomes he'd never know about. One choice, one moment of deciding that fear mattered less than humanity. The warriors began to move, turning their horses, preparing to ride back the way they'd come. The dusk began to rise. Again, catching the morning light, turning everything golden and red. Dalton stood in his doorway, one hand on the necklace, watching an army leave his land after saving his life. Cochetta was the last to mount. He sat tall on his horse, looking down at Dalton with an expression that had shifted from judgment to something closer to respect. "One more thing," he said. "My daughters told me you gave the water without knowing who they were, without knowing what might come from it." Dalton nodded, still processing everything that had happened in the last hour. "That matters," Cochetta continued. "Any man can be generous when he knows he will be rewarded. You were generous when you expected nothing. When you thought it might cost you everything, he gathered his reins. That is the difference between strategy and character." Aida guided her horse closer to the fence. "The next time drought comes, you will not face it alone. The next time raiders threaten your land, you will have allies. The next time you need help, send word. We will come." "How?" Dalton asked. His voice was stronger now, steadied by water one of the warriors had given him to drink. "How do I send word?" Kima smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "You will know when the time comes. You will know." She touched her hand to her chest over her heart. Some things do not require explanation. The 3 of them turned their horses. Behind them, the wall of warriors waited in perfect formation. Patient as stone, Kocha raised his hand one final time, not in threat, but in farewell. Then he lowered it, and the entire group began to move. They rode north, the same direction Aida and Kimla had been walking 3 days ago when thirst had driven them to Dalton's fence. The sound of hoof beats faded, gradually replaced by the familiar silence of the desert. The dust hung in the air long after they disappeared, a golden haze that caught the light and made everything look softer than it was. Dalton stood motionless until the last trace of them vanished, and his legs finally gave out. He sat down hard in the dirt, back against the cabin wall, staring at the supplies they'd left behind. Water barrels, food bundles, medicine for his horse, everything he needed to survive, given by people who had every reason to be his enemies. His hand moved to the necklace at his throat, bone and stone, leather and history. The weight of it felt strange, not because it was heavy, but because of what it represented, a bridge built by nothing more than choosing right over. Easy. He thought about the choices that had led here, the years of fear and distance he'd maintained between himself and the Apache, the stories he'd heard about raids and violence, all of which were true, but never the whole truth. The way he'd seen them as threats rather than people living through the same harsh conditions he faced. One moment had changed all of it. Not erased the history, not pretended the conflict hadn't happened, but proved that, underneath everything else, survival was something everyone understood, and that helping someone survive, even when it cost you, was a language that needed no translation. Dalton pulled himself to his feet, walked to the nearest water barrel. He removed the lid, looked inside at clear water that reflected the sky. Enough to last months, enough to give him time to figure out what came next. He dipped his hands in, brought water to his face, felt it run down his neck and soak into his shirt. It was the best thing he'd ever felt. He carried a bucket to the corral where his horse stood with its head still hanging low. The animal smelled the water before he got there, lifted its head, ears forward. Dalton poured it into the trough, watched the horse drink with desperate gulps. The sight made something in his chest loosen. They'd both survive. Against odds that had seemed impossible 3 days ago, they'd both make it. The sun climbed higher, burning away the haze the Apache had left behind. Dalton returned to his cabin, sat at his table, looked around at walls he'd expected to die between. Everything looked the same, but felt completely different, like the space itself had changed meaning. He picked up one of his books, the one with pages falling out, and opened it to a random spot. The words swam in his vision, not from dehydration anymore, but from exhaustion catching up. He'd been holding death at arm's length for so long that letting go of it left him hollowed out and shaking, but alive. He closed the book, set it aside. Through the window, he could see the desert stretching endless in every direction. Still harsh, still unforgiving, still capable of killing a man in 100 different ways. But now, when he looked at it, he saw something else too. The possibility that survival was not just about holding on to what you had, but about knowing when to reach out, when to trust, when to believe that giving might come back to you in ways you never expected. The necklace lay heavy against his chest, a reminder, a promise, a symbol of what happened when you chose humanity over fear. Dalton closed his eyes, let the exhaustion take him, and, for the first time in months, he slept without the weight of dying pressing on his chest. 3 weeks later, the rains finally came. Dalton stood in his doorway, watching water fall from a sky that had forgotten how to weep. It came down in sheets, drumming on the roof, turning the dust to mud, filling every crack in the parched earth with life. His rain barrel overflowed. The trough in the corral filled faster than his horse could drink. Water ran in streams past his fence, carving new paths through land that had been dry for so long. He walked out into it, let it soak through his shirt and run down his face. The cold shocked his skin. He tilted his head back, opened his mouth, tasted something he'd thought he might never taste again. The simple gift of water falling from the sky without cost or consequence. His horse stood in the corral with its head raised, rain running off its mane, looking healthier than it had in months. The medicine the Apache had brought had worked. The animal had put weight back on, regained the strength that drought had stolen. When Dalton approached, it nickered softly, no longer the defeated creature that had been waiting to die. The supplies the Apache had left were still stacked against the cabin wall, protected under a cover they'd shown him how to secure. He hadn't needed to use much of it. The rain had changed everything, but knowing it was there, knowing he didn't face the next crisis alone, that knowledge changed something deeper than just practical circumstances. Dalton touched the necklace at his throat. He wore it every day now, not as decoration, but as a reminder of what he'd learned, that the worst moments reveal who you are. That giving when you have nothing left is the only kind of giving that matters. That fear is a poor teacher compared to trust. He'd seen Apache riders twice since that morning 3 weeks ago. Once passing in the distance, heading north. They'd raised their hands in greeting, and he'd done the same. No words needed, just acknowledgement that the wall between them had been replaced by something else. Respect built on a single choice that could have gone differently. The second time a young warrior had stopped at his fence with a deer across his saddle. He gestured to it, then to Dalton, then ridden away before Dalton could refuse or thank him. The message was clear. They took care of their own, and Dalton was one of them now. He'd butchered the deer, dried the meat, stored it carefully, not just because he needed it, but because refusing would have been an insult to what they'd created together. This new understanding that survival was better shared than hoarded. The rain continued through the afternoon and into evening. Dalton sat on his porch, watching it fall, thinking about the path that had led here. The drought, the desperate choice, the 2 women at his fence, the wall of riders that had come not for revenge, but for recognition, each piece necessary, each moment building towards something he never could have predicted. He wondered if Aida and Kimi Mela thought about that day, if they told the story to others, if anyone understood how close it had all come to ending differently. One word of refusal, one moment of fear overriding humanity. That's all it would have taken to write a different ending. But he'd chosen otherwise, and that choice had rippled outward in ways he was still discovering. The desert would turn green in the coming weeks. Grass would grow, streams would run. The land would remember how to support life instead of testing it. Dalton would plant crops, rebuild his corral, maybe even ride to town now that the journey was possible again. But he'd do it all differently than before, not as a man isolated by fear and distance, as someone who understood that the strongest walls were the ones you chose to tear down. That true safety came not from keeping everyone out, but from knowing when to let the right people in. The necklace rested against his chest, warm from his skin, heavy with meaning, a symbol of the moment when 300 warriors had stood at his gate, not as enemies, but as proof that honor recognizes honor, that humanity speaks a language deeper than history or hatred, that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing what to give away. The rain fell harder, washing clean everything it touched. Dalton closed his eyes and listened to it drum against the earth, feeling grateful for storms, for second chances, and for the choices that define who you are when everything else has been stripped away. He'd given his last water to strangers. They'd returned with an army to save his life. And in that exchange, both sides had learned that survival was just the beginning. The real victory was in choosing to survive together. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and conscience collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.